hope you still have those Bibles handy. I'd like to invite you to reach for them and turn to Deuteronomy chapter 34. We are looking at our final message on the life of Moses, everyday hero. And we bring down the curtain today on the life of Moses, fittingly by looking at the narrative in Deuteronomy 34 of the death of Moses, a very dramatic, moving, and poignant scene that has etched its way to the minds of the church and of people throughout history. We're looking at Deuteronomy chapter 34, beginning with verse 1. Then Moses climbed Mount Nebo from the plains of Moab to the top of Pisgah across from Jericho. There the Lord showed him the whole land, from Gilead to Dan, all of Naphtali, the territory of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah as far as the Western Sea. And the Western Sea here is all the way across Israel to the Mediterranean. The Negev and the whole region from the valley of Jericho, the city of palms as far as Zoar. And the Lord said to him, "This is the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob when I said, I will give it to your descendants. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you will not cross over into it." And Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab, as the Lord had said. He buried him in Moab in the valley opposite Beth Peor, but to this day no one knows where his grave is. Moses was 120 years old when he died, yet his eyes were not weak, nor his strength gone. The Israelites grieved over Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days, until the time of weeping and mourning was over. Now Joshua, son of Nun, was filled with the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands on him. So the Israelites listened to him and did what the Lord had commanded Moses. Since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, who did all these miraculous signs and wonders the Lord sent him to do in Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his officials and to the whole land. For no one has ever shown the mighty power or performed the awesome deeds that Moses did in the sight of all Israel. Here ends the reading. Let me ask you a personal question. How would you like to die? It's going to happen. So given that fact, how would you like it to happen? I once did the memorial service of a man in his 80s who had just gotten out of a rowboat on his favorite lake on a sunny day, and he was at a family gathering, and he was walking along, and he was carrying in one hand a stringer full of rainbow trout. His other hand was resting on the shoulder of his 8-year-old grandson. He experienced some shortness of breath, sat down on a log, and slumped over and died. His whole family was gathered at that place to comfort each other. That's not a bad way to go. Or I once did the service of a grand matriarch of one of the great families of our church. She was in her 90s, lying in her own bed, surrounded by 3 generations of adoring family, and she slipped away as gently as if she had been carried off on angel's wings. And that's not a bad way to go. But my friends, of all the ways to shuffle off this mortal coil, the way I want to go is like Moses, mainly because he was 120 years old. But imagine you deliver a rousing speech to a weeping nation, and following that, you make a solo climb to a high mountain, and there you take in the breathtaking spectacle of the land that your children and grandchildren are going to inherit. And after that, you have a tete-a-tete with God. You lie down and fall asleep in the everlasting arms, and then God Almighty personally buries you in a grave that is left unmarked out of fear that your broken-hearted followers will turn it into a shrine that would rival their worship of God himself. I mean, that's on my bucket list, to have that kind of a way of going. Well, we know how we might want to exit, but now let me ask you this. What would you like for your epitaph? How would you like to be remembered? I mean, here's a chisel, and here's a hammer, and here's a stone. What would you like as your epitaph? How would you want to be remembered? For example, one lady I know said that she wanted her tombstone to read, "See, I told you I was sick." My father had a very warped sense of humor. He said he wanted his tombstone to read, "Shot by a jealous husband at 103. And then, of course, there's Frank Sinatra's who says, "I did it my way." It's very unlikely that any of us are going to exit this world like Moses did. But my friends, I'm here to tell you that within the reach of every person here in this room today to have the epitaph of Moses. You'll find it in verse 5 of chapter 34 of Deuteronomy. And here's what it says. It says, Moses, servant of the Lord. Did you know that throughout the Bible, there is not one place where Moses is ever referred to as a leader? One of the greatest leaders of Western civilization or of all history has never been referred to as a leader within the Bible. Not once. I've run computer checks. You'll never find Moses and leader put together. But again and again, he is called Moses, servant of the Lord. As a matter of fact, in the very next chapter, which is the first chapter of Joshua, God says, Moses, my servant, is dead. My friend, every day you are chiseling your epitaph. What would it mean for you and to me to have the epitaph of Moses, your name, servant of the Lord? First principle we learn from Moses is that to be a servant of the Lord means that you have an enormous sense of personal destiny that comes from God's call in your life. Now notice Moses was not called servant of the Israelites. He's called servant of the Lord. From the very moment that Moses stood before the burning bush and his mouth fell open, Moses lived every moment before the audience of one. Very many leaders today tend to lead with a wet finger, wondering which way the wind is blowing. We have leadership by focus group. Moses' brother Aaron was a modern leader. Remember, Moses went up and the people came to Aaron and said, well, we want to have a new God. And so Aaron consulted with his pollsters and said, well, the people might really like to have a God as a golden calf. And that's what he gave them. Moses would not have done that. He would have died before he would ever betray God. I was once reading an op-ed article in the New York Times written by Henry Kissinger on what makes a hero. And here's what Dr. Kissinger wrote. He said, the political leaders with whom we are familiar generally aspire to be superstars rather than heroes. The distinction is critical. Superstars strive for the blessing of others. Heroes walk alone. Superstars crave consensus. Heroes define themselves by the judgment of a future they see it as their task to bring about. I love that. Heroes define themselves by the judgment of a future they see as their task to bring about. Superstars seek success as a technique for eliciting support. Heroes pursue success as the outgrowth of their inner values. One of the things I often say to young aspiring leaders is get free of people so you can lead them. And friends, one of the best ways I know to do that is to have a sense of personal destiny that comes from the call of God in your life. Mary, Queen of Scots, was speaking of her arch enemy, John Knox, when she said, I would rather meet the devil than to meet one Presbyterian convinced he's doing the will of God. Friends, that's our heritage. And yet the problem with our heritage might be that we would get full of ourselves and think it's all about us. Like one of the cabinet members of Winston Churchill who had a huge ego. And one day the man left the room and Winston Churchill said, there but for the grace of God goes God. And so along with this sense of personal destiny, friends, we need something else as we are servants of God. And that is, we see in Moses a profound personal humility. And nowhere do we see the humility of Moses as much as we do in that scene where Moses comes down Mount Sinai with having tucked under his arm the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments. Now listen for a moment. Once the children of Israel got across the Red Sea, they had a crisis moment. And the question is, what do we do now? What's going to be the glue that holds this nation together? When they were in Egypt, they were held together and unified by their opposition to the common foe against Pharaoh. But now here they were. What is going to unify the people of Israel? It's sort of the classic question. What do you do after the revolution? It was the problem that the Soviet republics had in the early 1990s. And the options that Israel had were twofold. They had one option, which was authoritarianism. I mean, it made a lot of sense that Moses would say, okay, I'm the new Pharaoh. Whatever I say goes. I'm the one who calls the shots. The other alternative was anarchy. It's like what we see in a lot of Africa today, where whoever has a gun is in charge wherever they are. And we saw Israel had a taste of anarchy when Moses went up the hill, the people went crazy and they went wild and all that sort of thing. So which was it going to be? Is it going to be authoritarianism or will it be anarchy? My friends, Moses comes down the mountain and he carries in his hands a third way. Between authoritarianism and anarchy, he carries the rule of law. freedom under law, which has been the basis of free societies ever since that time. And what that means is that even the leader is not above the law. There would come a day in Israel when in Israel there would be a prophet who would stand before no less than King David himself and say, "Thou art the man who has broken two of the laws, the sixth and the seventh commandment. Thou hast committed murder. You've committed adultery, David." And David would have to fall to his knees. And friends, that never would have happened with Pharaoh, because Pharaoh was the law. You know, this last Friday, we celebrated the birthday of our American Moses, the father of our country, George Washington. There's so many parallels between Moses and George Washington. For one thing, George Washington, like Moses, was not a good public speaker. Another thing is, like Moses, George Washington could have just said the word and they would have made him king of this new nation. In fact, after the Revolution, there was a move to make George Washington the king, and George Washington wrote letters to put down and squelch that move to make him king. Because like Moses, he said, this nation needs the rule of law. And therefore, all of our leaders, none of them are ever above the law. I want to say to you, if you walk out of here into your week and you're the boss where you go, do you keep the laws? Do you keep the rules? Or are you a Pharaoh? We must never let our sense of personal destiny override the profound humility we're called to as the servants of the Lord. Servant leaders have a powerful sense of destiny. It's tempered by humility. And then there's a third principle from Moses, and that is we express ourselves through the practicality of serving. And friends, I think that's why Moses lived to such a ripe old age. We're told here in verse 7 that Moses lived to 120 years old, and, I quote, Moses' eyes were not weak, nor was his strength gone. Now, some scholars believe that that is a roundabout way of saying that Moses could still father children at the age of 120. He was hitting on all cylinders in his old age. Why? Because Moses had so much to live for. It's almost like the old song, "Don't Have Time to Die." I mean, when Moses was the leader for 40 years, the children of Israel would fall asleep at night, shut their eyes, knowing that his eyes were always open. Moses was like a pillar of fire that lit the way and warmed their hearts and supported and encouraged the people. And he lived until 120 years old. I remember one time driving along and I was listening to a radio program in my car, and there was a doctor who was talking about the factors in longevity. And he acknowledged the conventional wisdom that if you look at your grandparents lived a long time, then the chances are you will too. But he also said that he'd seen so many exceptions to that rule that he was open to different new studies. And a while ago, there came out a study that was done where interviewers had interviewed people in their 80s with an exhausted battery of questions that included diet, weight, nationality, education, sleeping habits, marital history, lifestyle, grandparents' longevity. And their answers to these questions were all different, and they were all inconclusive except for one. And that is, every one of these octogenarians could not wait to get up in the morning. Each one of them had a passion for something. There was an arthritic retired dentist who would hobble down to count cavities at the local dentist's office. There was a retired sheep farmer in Utah who became the handyman, volunteering his services to all of his neighbors. There was a 96-year-old woman who recovered from hip surgery in record time because she had to get home to tend her gardening. My friends, in other words, the greatest need that any of us have here in this room is our need to be needed. And no one was needed more than Moses. You say, well, what do we do for Moses? Nobody needs me. Well, friend, that's where you're wrong. And I want to challenge you on that. I want to say to you, you are needed in the very venue where Moses was needed, and that is in serving among God's people. And I challenge you to call my bluff on that. And if you email me this week, and you can find my email very easily in that bulletin or wherever, one of our staff members or myself, we'll get back in touch with you, and we will connect you with that place tailor-made by God for your gifts and experiences to carve your epitaph as a servant of the Lord here in this place. To find the amazing place that Frederick Buechner spoke of so beautifully when he said, the place to which God calls me is where intersects the world's deep need and my great joy. You know, the other thing, in the practicality of serving, you don't have to wait. You can start doing that right now this afternoon in the mundane household chores in your family. Many of us who are younger and children, we just aren't in touch with the machinery it takes to keep a family going and food on the table and the house clean and all those sorts of things. I had a moment of aha where I had my eyes open a number of years ago when I was at a pastor's retreat. And I was in my small group with a group of other pastors when the camp director came running into the room and said, Dr. Pence, there's been an emergency call. Call your administrative assistant immediately. And so I ran and I called my administrative assistant. I said, June, what's going on? She said, Vic, I don't want to frighten you, but the Houston police called and your doors of your house are open. Your alarm's going off. Everyone in the neighborhood can hear it. There's no sign of Becky anywhere, and the house has been ransacked. I said, you don't want to frighten me. Good heavens. So I called my across-the-street neighbor, Carol Johnson. I said, Carol, what's going on? She said, Vic, it's true. The police were here. The door was open. Becky's nowhere to be found. The house is ransacked. Then she says, wait a minute. That's Becky's van. Becky just pulled into the driveway. I said, thanks, Carol. I called Becky up. I said, Becky, what's going on? I mean, gosh, they called me and they said the police were there and the door was open and house is ransacked. Becky said, Vic, it's been a hard week. The girls are out of control. The wind blew the door open, and that's what our house looks like. So we have a police report that says our house looks like it's been ransacked. My friend, servanthood begins at home. Pick up your stuff. You be the one who runs to grab the paper towels to wipe the salsa off the carpet. You know, a great way to be a servant, I've learned, is if you're the one who clears off the table after dinner quietly while other people carry on the conversation, that's a wonderful act of servanthood, isn't it? You quietly slip off the dishes and they're still talking. That's a wonderful act of practical servanthood. Be the one who pushes the trash can out to the street through the practicality of service. You can carve your epitaph. Well, there's a fourth principle from Moses of the servants of God. We have destiny. We have this humility. We have the practicality of serving. But fourth, and really encouraging, is we have the security of knowing that our flaws do not disqualify us as servants of God. And that's such good news for me because I have to confess to you, I have days, many days as pastor of this church where I feel in the cockpit of a 747. I have no idea which buttons to push. I don't know how to get this thing off the ground. And you know, eventually that frustration got to Moses and it did him in. And it led to the great sadness of his life that Moses did not enter the promised land. The party had to go on without Moses. One day they came to the place of Kadesh. And I think this was a factor. It was at Kadesh that Moses' sister Miriam died. Miriam was one of the few people still alive with whom he could still talk about the old days in Egypt with the pharaohs and the pyramids and all that. And now Miriam had died. The other thing that happened while they were at Kadesh is that they ran out of water. And this new young generation of Israelites ripped into Moses and Aaron up one side and down the other. They just tore them apart brutally and verbally in criticism. And they even charged them with engineering the water shortage to kill the people off. Something snapped inside Moses. God had told him to speak to the rock and the water would flow. Moses instead took his rod and he smashed it. And then he took it again and he smashed the rock again. And the sounds of the blows echoed across the still desert air. You ever have your critics get to you and you live to regret what your response was? Well, why is it that Moses didn't get to enter the promised land? Some people are very literal. They say, well, God said, speak to the rock. Moses hit the rock. Therefore, he disobeyed God. Therefore, he didn't get to the promised land. I don't buy it quite that simply. There are other people that have a more exotic understanding. I've read one scholar who said, well, by tapping the rock, Moses was acting like the magicians in Egypt. And to this day, a magician, what they will do is, they'll take the glass of water, put it in the black box, and they will take a rod and they will tap it. And so was Moses trying to arrogate to himself the magical power to bring forth the water from the rock? I think God said, Moses, it sounds like it's time for you to come home. You're burned out. You're tired. It's better here with me than it is in the promised land. So Moses, come on home. That's not what Moses wanted to do, though. And that old man standing on top of Mount Nebo looking across the Dead Sea feels like he is 40 miles from his dreams coming true. He yearns to run his fingers through the soil, to taste the fruit, to touch the stones. He came so close. But you know what they say, close only counts in horseshoes, not promised lands. And so Moses will not go. Reminds me of the words of Robert Frost, who said, no memory of having starred can make up for later disregard or keep the end from being hard. But I also want to say to you, there's a wonderful word of hope to us in this scene, and that is to know that the second most impressive, influential person in the Bible, next only to Jesus, was a flawed person just like you and me. And today, still people who are oppressed around the world will look around and say, if only we could find a Moses who would lead us to freedom. Very often we have this idea that we've got to get our act together first, and then God will use us. So if I can get my own house in order, then I will be able to be used by God. Friend, if you could get your house in order without God, you wouldn't need God. And so the principle of Moses is just come as you are to God, as you are right now. Give your life to him. As someone has said, like a puppy deposits a slobbery tennis ball at the feet of its master, give your life to God, and he will use you as his servant. And if you ever feel like you can't be used by God, just remember this. Noah was a drunk. Abraham was too old. Isaac was a daydreamer. Leah was homely. Joseph was abused. Moses stuttered. Gideon was afraid. Samson was a womanizer. Rahab was a prostitute. Elijah was suicidal. Isaiah preached naked. Jonah ran from God. Naomi was a widow. Job went bankrupt. John the Baptist ate bugs. Martha worried about everything. The Samaritan woman was divorced more than once. Zacchaeus was too small. Paul was too religious. And Lazarus was dead. And if you got a problem bigger than that, raise your hand. The rest of you God can use. And you can carve with your each and every day your epitaph, as Moses did, servant of the Lord.